Tuesday, March 9th, 1965. The convent of San Giovanni Rotondo was shaken by an unexpected arrival. A man had come from Rome. Not just any man, a cardinal, one of the highest-ranking princes of the Roman Church, had traveled all the way to southern Italy to deliver a private message to Padre Pio. But here is what makes this visit so unusual. The cardinal had received instructions. Do not draw attention. Do not make this public. This was not a ceremony. This was not a celebration. This was a private mission, sent directly from the desk of Pope Paul VI. This episode is recorded in the documentation compiled for Padre Pio's beatification cause by Giuseppe Pagnossin and confirmed by a second independent witness, a Capuchin priest who lived alongside Padre Pio for years. What I am about to tell you is not legend. It is history. At this point in his life, Padre Pio was already an old man, fragile, suffering. He had just endured years of persecution, slander, threats, and injustice, carried out by men close to Pope John XXIII. The last thing he needed was another problem coming from Rome. And yet, a prince of the Church had come, just for him. What message could be so important that a cardinal had to deliver it in person, and in discretion? What had Padre Pio asked from the Pope that required such extraordinary measures? And what does this forgotten episode reveal about the greatest liturgical controversy in the history of the Catholic Church? Before I tell you what the cardinal said, I need to give you some context, because the date matters more than you might think. 2 days before this visit, on March 7th, the first Sunday of Lent, 1965, something had happened for the very first time in the history of the Catholic Church. Across the world, masses were celebrated in the vernacular language, using experimental liturgical texts. The ancient Latin prayers that had been spoken for centuries were, for the first time, being replaced. Now, the new Mass as we know it today would not be officially promulgated until April of 1969, more than 4 years later. But the experiments had already begun. And Padre Pio had already reacted. A full month before those experimental masses were even celebrated, on February 7th, 1965, Padre Pio had written to Pope Paul VI. He asked, some say begged, to be exempted from the liturgical experiment, to be allowed to continue celebrating the Mass according to the ancient rite, the rite of his ordination, the rite that had forged centuries of saints. Think about what this means. He did not wait to see what would happen. He did not give it a chance. He acted before the changes were even implemented. What he knew, or what he sensed, we cannot say with certainty. But the timing speaks for itself. Paul VI granted the request, and on March 9th, he sent Cardinal Antonio Bacci to deliver the indult in person. Bacci was no ordinary messenger. He was one of the Vatican's greatest Latin scholars, a man who had served 4 popes. During the council, he had publicly defended Latin as the liturgical language. He was also one of the 2 cardinals who would later present the famous brief critical examination of the new order of Mass to Paul VI in 1969. In other words, the Pope chose to send someone who understood exactly what this exemption meant. The news was good. Padre Pio would be allowed to celebrate the Mass, as he had always done, in Latin according to the traditional rite, until the day he died. The authorization consoled him. He had been deeply worried about the reforms agitating the Church and the divisions tearing through the Council Fathers. But after thanking the cardinal, after receiving the document, Padre Pio said something else, something that has been quoted and debated for 60 years. He looked at the Pope's emissary and said, "For pity's sake, end the council quickly." Now, what did he mean? Those who knew him best later explained that Padre Pio was not so much against the council itself. He was troubled, deeply troubled, by the direction it had taken. He spoke multiple times, with visible sorrow, about what he called a church without a helmsman. He used a vivid expression: "The fish rots from the head." He feared the overwhelming innovations. He distrusted the factions he saw pushing the church toward what he could not recognize. And he remembered well an ancient warning that had been passed down through the centuries, that not even a comma of sound doctrine should be changed. But to understand why the Mass, specifically, was the thing Padre Pio fought to protect, you need to understand what happened every time he stepped up to the altar. Since his ordination in August of 1910, Padre Pio's celebration of the Mass was something that no one who witnessed it could ever explain. When the young friar returned to Pietrelcina because of his fragile health, the local people began to notice that something was deeply unusual about him. His masses were extraordinarily long, so long that the farmers, who needed to get to the fields before dawn, simply could not stay. The church would gradually empty. Even the sacristan gave up. He would open the door, check that everything was in order, and then leave Padre Pio alone, to contemplate his Jesus. One witness from that period kept a diary, a typewritten journal that to this day has never been published. In it, he described Padre Pio's Mass as an incomprehensible mystery. During the memento, the silent prayer within the canon, Padre Pio would become so deeply absorbed that more than an hour would pass without him continuing the liturgy. Not a pause, not a hesitation, an hour, motionless, lost in something invisible. The people could not wait. The local archpriest, a man named Panullo, took responsibility for the situation. He even confronted the guardian of the Capuchin convent about it. And here is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. The guardian asked the archpriest to summon Padre Pio mentally, through thought alone, believing that out of holy obedience, the friar would respond. Panullo was a skeptical man, not one to be fooled. He agreed to try, but he only pretended to believe. And yet, every single day, when Padre Pio celebrated Mass, the archpriest would go to the church, and from a distance, direct him by thought. And Padre Pio would obey, immediately, every time. Years later, when Panullo was close to death, he said to a friend, "I am already with my feet in the grave, Peppino, and you must believe that everything I told you is true." Now, I want to be clear. This is a personal testimony, not a formally verified miracle, but it is consistent with everything else we know about Padre Pio's relationship with the Mass. One of the most respected Catholic intellectuals of the 20th century, a philosopher, a personal friend of Paul VI, visited San Giovanni Rotondo and watched Padre Pio at the altar. Writing in a major French Catholic newspaper in 1968, he described what he saw. Padre Pio approached the altar bearing the full weight of his broken body at 4 a.m, before a crowd of faithful, rich and poor, pressed together to form a single motionless body, a single silent prayer. The suffering increased as the Mass progressed. When he reached the canon, he stopped, as if standing before an impossible climb. A meeting, the philosopher wrote, of painful and radiant love, an inexpressible mystery, a mystery that could kill. Those who studied Padre Pio's inner spiritual life described what happened after the consecration. He entered into the stages of Christ's agony, all the way to what Scripture calls the 9th hour. the 7 last words, the abandonment, the offering of the sorrowful mother to John, all the way to the consummatum est. It is finished. That Mass, mystically, was the same as it had been 2,000 years ago, and those who were present became part of Calvary itself. This is what the Mass was for Padre Pio. Not a symbol, not a community gathering, not a tradition to be updated. It was the living sacrifice of Christ, made present again on the altar through a rite that had been prayed by saints for centuries. And now, someone was preparing to change it. Here is where I need to be completely honest with you, because this story has been claimed by many voices over the decades, and not all of them are telling you the whole truth. On one side, certain traditionalist groups present Padre Pio as a man who flatly rejected the liturgical reform. They point to his request for the indult, his remark to Cardinal Bacci, and his expressions of sorrow. And these things are real. They are documented. But they go further than the evidence allows. Some say he rejected the Novus Ordo. But here is the simple historical reality. Padre Pio died on September 23rd, 1968. The new Mass was promulgated on April 3rd, 1969, 6 months after his death. He never celebrated it. He never even saw it. So to claim he rejected it is to speculate about what he would have done. And speculation, no matter how confident, is not testimony. On the other side, there are those who claim Padre Pio fully embraced the council and accepted every change with joy. His personal secretary stated that Padre Pio agreed completely with the theology of the Second Vatican Council and believed Pope John XXIII had done the right thing. He said Padre Pio was proud of the council, though he acknowledged discomfort with the changes in language and ritual. So how do we reconcile these testimonies? A man who begged the Pope for an exemption, who said, "End the council quickly," who spoke of a church without a helmsman, and yet whose own secretary said he supported the council. The honest answer is this: both are true. And the tension between them is not a contradiction. It is the mystery. There is one more piece of evidence that I think reveals more than anything else about Padre Pio's heart. In 1966 or 1967, the Holy See gave him permission to celebrate Mass in Latin, seated, but under 2 conditions. He had to face the people, and he had to use a new form of the Eucharistic prayer that was then being developed. When a fellow friar, frustrated by the changes being imposed on this aging, dying saint, muttered under his breath that he did not understand why the church had to bother a poor old sick priest, Padre Pio nearly wept. He said the church had asked very little of him, that it was he who was causing trouble because he wanted to perform the new rite correctly. And when the friar told him to just do it however he wished, Padre Pio became firm. "No," he said, "I must perform the rite precisely as the church desires." This is not a man in rebellion. This is a man in agony. Caught between his love for the ancient rite and his obedience to the church he had served his entire life. He begged for the exemption. He expressed sorrow. And yet, when the church asked something of him, even something that pained him to the depths of his soul, he wept and he obeyed. What would he have done if he had lived long enough to face the fully implemented new Mass? Would he have obeyed? Would he have continued the old rite? Would he have suffered in silence? We cannot say. No one can. And anyone who tells you they know the answer is putting their own words into the mouth of a saint. What we do know is how the story ends. On September 22nd, 1968, One day after the 50th anniversary of receiving the Stigmata, Padre Pio was supposed to celebrate a solemn Mass for the pilgrims present. But he was so exhausted that he asked his superiors for permission to celebrate a low Mass instead. His superior initially agreed, but then Padre Pio saw the crowd, thousands of people who had come from all over the world, and he changed his mind. He would offer one last solemn Mass, in Latin, with a deacon and a subdeacon, with parts of the liturgy sung by his own failing voice. The footage of this Mass still exists. You can watch it. And what you see is a man who can barely stand. He was held by both arms as he walked to the altar. For the past 6 months, he had used a wheelchair. But now, for this last time, he wanted to stand on his own. He sang the Gloria in Excelsis Deo. He sang the Credo in Unum Deum. He was helped to sit down as the Mass continued. And when he raised the paten for the offertory, and when he raised the chalice, something was visible that no one expected. The wounds were gone. The stigmata, the bleeding wounds that had marked his hands, his feet, and his side for exactly 50 years, had disappeared, without a scar, without a trace, as if he had never had them at all. At the end of the Mass, while the organ played a joyous finale, Padre Pio tried to leave the altar, but he had no strength left. He was about to collapse. The crowd cried out. The organ stopped. A large American friar named Bill Martin ran forward and caught him in his arms, holding him upright until he could be placed in a wheelchair and taken to the sacristy. That night, he received extreme unction. In the early hours of September 23rd, he called his superior to his room and asked to make his confession one final time. He renewed his vows: poverty, chastity, obedience. He mouthed the words of the Rosary, too weak to speak them aloud. And according to some who were present, just before he died, he whispered that he could see 2 mothers, believed to be the Blessed Virgin and his own mother, who had died decades before. His final words were, "Jesus, Mary." He died at 2:30 in the morning. He was 81 years old. 10 minutes after his death, the guardian of the monastery confirmed that all traces of the stigmata had completely vanished from his body. Not a mark, not a scar, nothing. 6 months later, the new Mass was officially promulgated. He never had to face the choice that thousands of priests after him would face. Padre Pio once said, "It would be easier for the world to exist without the sun than without the Holy Mass." For him, the Mass was not merely important. It was the axis of the universe, the sacrifice that held back the darkness. And when he saw that sacrifice being touched, being experimented upon, he did not respond with anger or rebellion. He responded the way he always responded, with prayer, with suffering, with obedience. Some will see in this story a vindication of the traditional Mass. Others will see a model of obedience, even in disagreement. I think the honest answer is that both are true, and that the tension between them is what makes Padre Pio's witness so powerful. He did not give us easy answers. He gave us something harder. The example of a man who loved something with his entire soul, who feared it was being lost, and who placed that fear into the hands of God, at the same altar where he placed his blood. His stigmata disappeared the day before he died, as if the offering was complete, as if the sacrifice had been accepted. And he was spared from having to face the full weight of what came after him. Was that a mercy? Was that providence? I will leave that question to you. Before I share the sources for this video, I want to mention something. Over the past few years, I have spent hundreds of hours studying the life of Padre Pio, reading his letters, studying the testimonies of those who lived with him, and trying to understand not just what he did, but how he prayed, how he suffered, and how he loved God. All of that research became a book, Learning the Spiritual Life with Padre Pio. It is not a biography. It is more like a guide for anyone who feels called to go deeper into the spiritual life through the eyes of this extraordinary saint. If that speaks to you, I will leave the link in the description below. And now, let me give you the sources for everything you just heard. Now, everything I shared with you today is documented. I did not invent a single detail. Here are the sources, so you can verify them yourself. The visit of Cardinal Bacci to San Giovanni Rotondo on March 9th, 1965, the papal indult, and the quote, "For pity's sake, end the council quickly," are recorded in the Piccola Cronologia per la causa di beatificazione di Padre Pio by Giuseppe Pagnossin, and confirmed independently by Father Carmelo da Sessano, whose testimony was published in the Italian magazine Il Settimanale on January 4th, 1975. The details about the authorization and Padre Pio's consolation are documented in Padre Pio, Una strada di misericordia, by the French historian Yves Chiron, a member of the Society of Ecclesiastical History of France. The account of Padre Pio's reaction to the liturgical changes, "I must perform the rite precisely as the Church desires," comes from Father Pellegrino Funicelli's 1991 book, Padre Pio's Jack of All Trades. Father Pellegrino was with Padre Pio when he died. The testimony of Father John Aurelia, Padre Pio's personal secretary, stating that Padre Pio agreed with the theology of the Second Vatican Council, is recorded in interviews published by the blog Defending Vatican II. The descriptions of Padre Pio's masses in Pietrelcina come from the unpublished diary of Don Giuseppe Orlando, and the testimony of Archpriest Pannuglio, as cited in the book A Ultima Missa de Padre Pio. The philosopher who described Padre Pio's Mass was Jean Guitton, writing in the French Catholic newspaper La Croix in 1968. The spiritual analysis of Padre Pio at the altar comes from the book Padre Pio nella sua interiorità. The details of Padre Pio's last Mass on September 22, 1968, including the rare footage, the disappearance of the Stigmata, and the events of his final hours, are widely documented and can be verified through multiple sources, including the testimony of the Father Guardian of the monastery. All of this is real. All of this happened. And it happened to a man who bore the wounds of Christ on his body for 50 years,